The Sprinkler Rebellion, How One Man Dethroned the Queen of the HOA. Ethan jolted awake to the jarring clatter of metal and strange voices echoing through his window, his heart instantly slamming in his chest. Expecting a garbage truck, he gradually pulled back. The blind sand froze. His backyard, his sanctuary, his meticulously maintained private property, had been hijacked. Rows of white chairs littered his grass. A grotesque arch smothered in flowers stood like a mocking monument, and decorators buzzed around like ants on stolen sugar. And at the center of the chaos stood Herkirin, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, barking commands like a dictator with a clipboard. Rage surged through Ethan like wildfire as he stormed outside. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, voice sharp enough to slice the morning air. She smiled smugly, waving a hand as if he were an unruly child. "It's just for the day, darling. My son's wedding, a whole approved event." Ethan's jaw dropped. Approved. He'd never been asked. Karen had twisted the HOA's ruly sog on forcing her will onto others like some suburban tyrant. A DJ blared music near his fence. Caterers blocked his driveway. And was that a porta-potty in his front yard? His fists clenched. This wasn't just rude, it was war. She threatened him with fines, violations, and fake citations, daring him to fight back. But Ethan had a plan. Deep beneath his yard, old sprinkler pipes still lingered, filled with vile, iron-rich water, forgotten relics of a bygone plumbing era. With a smile carved from spite, Ethan plotted her downfall. He'd let her think she'd won, let her bask in her delusions until the perfect moment. Then, with one flick of a switch, he would drown her perfect little fantasy in filth and ruin. She wanted a show. She would get one. And it would be the last time Karen underestimated Ethan Andrews. Ethan stood in his kitchen, gripping his coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping him from shattering every dish in his cabinets. His mind reeled from the violation. Karen had turned his backyard into a full-blown wedding venue without even the decency of a warning. And now she was out there, waltzing through his garden as if she owned it, waving to vendors and directing traffic like some tyrannical wedding planner who'd mistaken dictatorship for charm. It wasn't the first time she had twisted the HOA's rules to suit her needs, but this was another level. As he watched through the blinds, a group of bridesmaids posed in front of the koi pond he'd built by hand. They giggled and snapped selfies, oblivious to the fact that their picturesque backdrop had been stolen. He had spent years enduring Karen's smug superiority, her passive-aggressive newsletters, her weaponized fines for unauthorized bird feeders or inadequate grass height. This wedding. Thought this was personal. She hadn't just disrespected his property. She had trampled over his boundaries like they didn't exist, confident her web of bogus HOA policies would protect her. He had considered calling the police, but Karen had wrapped everything in enough red tape and fabricated paperwork to make it look official. He needed something smarter, something devastating. Then his gaze fell on the rusted sprinkler control panel mounted in the garage, the forgotten system he hadn't used in years because the water it pumped out was foul, rusty, and thick with iron sediment. The very idea sparked a slow, vicious grin across his face. If Karen wanted a wedding in his yard, then she'd get Oni along with the fetid, swampy nightmare that came with it. He'd wait until the perfect moment, when the guests were seated, when the music swelled, when her son's bride took that first elegant step down the ice lane. Then he'd let hell rain down. Not early, not yet. No, she needed to believe she had won. He would give her that high, that illusion of victory, and then tear it all down. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming his dignity, his space, his life. She had weaponized the HOA for years, turning neighbors against each other, pushing her will with charm, manipulation, and subtle threats. But now Ethan had the chance to hit her where it hurt, not with violence, not with lawyers, but with karma disguised as plumbing. He would turn her crowning moment into her public downfall. And as he paced in his kitchen, each step tighter with rage, he knew with absolute certainty, when the mud hit those silk gowns and the speakers sparked and the cake collapsed into sludge, Karen would finally understand what it felt like to be powerless. The queen of the HOA was about to be dethroned by a switch, a spray, and a homeowner who'd finally had enough. The sun was high, the music swelling with delicate strings, as the first bridesmaid began her slow walk down the makeshift aisle that sliced through Ethan's once pristine backyard. From his kitchen window, he watched it all with ice in his veins and a finger hovering over the sprinkler switch. Every detail was perfect. The white chairs gleamed, the flower arrangements danced in the breeze, and Karen stood at the front, her expression soaked in smug satisfaction. She hadn't even looked toward his house all morning. She thought she'd won. She believed, in her delusion, that she had bullied Ethan into silence like she had with everyone else for years. But today wasn't like the other days. Today, her reckoning was queued and ready, waiting just beneath the lawn. His lawn. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, remembering every HOA violation she'd weaponized against him, every letter, every fine, every warning for nothing more than living his life. And now, she had the audacity to stage a wedding without permission on the very ground she once threatened to penalize him over because his azaleas were too chaotic. Ethan smiled grimly. This was justice, not just for him, but for every neighbor who'd quietly suffered her reign. The guests stood, heads turning toward the start of the aisle, the music crescendoing with theatrical precision. Then he saw Herkran's son's bride, in a gown so wide it practically glowed. She stepped forward, blissfully unaware of the storm about to erupt beneath her feet. Ethan didn't hesitate. He flipped the switch. At first, it was subtly sputtering hiss from the forgotten pipes underground. Then came the spray, dark and furious, water gushing from sprinkler heads with a force born of years-long neglect. Brown, foul-smelling water spewed into the air, arcing over the carefully arranged decor and soaking everything in its path. Gasps turned into screams. The front rows were hit first, elderly guests slipping backward, their designer clothes instantly stained. The bridesmaids shrieked, lifting their dresses as they scrambled through the muck. Ethan watched with satisfaction as the white chairs toppled, the tablecloth is turned to sludge, and the towering wedding cake sagged and collapsed under the torrent. The DJ's setup sparked, crackled, and died in a puff of smoke. Chaos was absolute. And then came the bride. She stepped into the yard, confusion morphing into horror as the bottom of her gown disappeared into a pool of rust-colored sludge. She screamed, stumbling back, and Karen finally turned and looked. Her expression, once gleaming with victory, curdled into something hollow and desperate. She scanned the yard like a ship captain watching her vessel sink, until her eyes locked on Ethan's house. He stepped out onto the back porch, arms folded, radiating calm fury. Karen stormed toward him, mud splashing up her legs. "You did this," she shrieked. Ethan shrugged. "Should have booked a real venue?" Karen stood frozen in the mud, her heels sinking into the sludge that had once been Ethan's perfectly manicured backyard. The wedding was in ruins, decorations shredded, guests fleeing, the DJ's equipment smoking, and the cake reduced to a soggy pile of sugary rubble. But it wasn't just the physical wreckage that left her breathless. It was the look on her son's face. Miles, the groom, stood at the edge of the chaos, his hands limp at his sides, his tux soaked, and his jaw clenched in disbelief. Stephanie, the bride, was in tears, her gown ruined, her mascara streaked like war paint. She turned to her mother with venom in her voice. "You told me this was a real venue," she choked out. "You said everything was handled," Karen stammered, her confidence unraveling in front of everyone. "Sweetheart, if this was always the plan, it's just a setback." But no one was listening. The guests whispered, some opally filming with their phones, others retreating in disgust. Then Miles spoke. "You lied to us." He shook his head, stepping toward Stephanie, voice low but firm. "She lied to both of us. We were supposed to get married at Lakeside Hall. Remember? That was the plan. But she blew the money again." Karen's eyes darted around, desperate for control. "This is a misunderstanding. The HOA approved this. It was all legal." But her words fell flat. Stephanie's expression darkened. "You used HOA money to pay for your spa weekends and landscaping," she said, voice cracking. "You spent the wedding fund on yourself and tried to cover it up by hijacking a neighbor's yard." A gasp rippled through what remained of the crowd. Then, as if on cue, Tom, the only decent voice on the HOA board, stepped forward. "Karen," he said grimly, holding a manila folder, "we've been reviewing the HOA's finances. This morning, a few of us got some troubling emails. Vendor receipts that don't match. Reimbursements with no explanation. It's not looking good." Karen's mask dropped. "You're siding with him," she spat, gesturing toward Ethan. "This is his fault." Tom shook his head. "No, Karen. You made this mess, and now we're calling for a full audit. There's talk of dissolving the HOA altogether." That struck harder than any sprinkler blast. Her empire, built on years of manipulation, was cracking in front of her eyes. The crowd was no longer hers to command. Ethan leaned against his porch railing, arms crossed, as Karen tried to speak, to salvage some dignity, but her voice was drowned by murmurs of betrayal and talk of legal action. She turned back to Ethan, her face red, her fists trembling. "You'll regret this," she snarled. But Ethan only smiled. "Maybe," he said coolly, "but I've got my yard back. And you've got a front row seat to your own downfall." The wedding was over, but the real ceremony had just begun. The burial of Karen's reign, with the neighborhood as witness. The morning after the wedding turned disaster, Ethan stepped barefoot into his backyard, coffee steaming in his hand, and took in the battlefield. The grass was matted with dried mud. Flower petals clung to broken folding chairs like sad confetti, and the archon draped in delicate rose of snow leaned at an awkward angle, listing like a shipwreck. Shattered plates glinted in the sunlight beside the wilted ruins of what had been an extravagant, three-tiered cake. But despite the mess, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years: peace. For the first time in a long time, Karen wasn't watching him from across the street, clipboard in hand, inventing new violations just to make his life miserable. Her iron grip on the neighborhood had snapped like a brittle branch, and the once untouchable queen of the HOA was now the talk of the town for all the wrong reasons. Word had spread like wildfire. Everyone knew about the fraudulent use of HOA funds. Everyone had seen the chaos, the ruined wedding, the public humiliation, and best of all, the board that once cowered beneath Karen's control had turned on her. Tom had already called Ethan that morning, his voice practically buzzing with vindication. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight," he'd said. "We're voting on whether to dissolve the whole thing. Bring popcorn." Ethan had chuckled at that. "Be there, front row." But the real kicker had come just 10 minutes ago. Karen's front door had creaked open, and for the first time since the ceremony imploded, she had appeared, wearing oversized sunglasses, hair in a disheveled bun. She scurried to her car like a fugitive, glancing around as if expecting someone to hurl tomatoes. She clutched her phone to her chest like a lifeline, then slammed the car door and sped off down the street. She wasn't just hiding, she was running. Ethan leaned against the railing of his porch and exhaled, the scent of wet earth and scorched audio equipment still lingering in the air. He knew Karen. She wouldn't stick around for an audit or a lawsuit. No, she'd vanish before the real consequences landed. He almost felt bad for Stefania most. But the truth was, she had stood by her mother's side for too long, excusing her behavior, enabling the manipulation. That blind loyalty had finally cost her everything: her wedding, her fiancé, her reputation. Ethan spotted David. Miles would have been brother-in-law crossing the street. He looked exhausted but calm. "Didn't think I'd see you again?" Ethan called. David gave a tired grin. "Didn't think I'd want to come back, but I needed closure." He looked around the wreckage and whistled. "Man, this place really took a hit." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, but I call it cleansing." David chuckled. "You might have ruined a wedding, but you saved a neighborhood." Ethan raised his mug in a toast to peace, freedom, and filthy sprinkler water. As David laughed and walked away, Ethan settled back into his chair, content. The storm had passed, and this time it had washed the tyrant away with it. That evening, as the golden glow of sunset bathed the quiet neighborhood in warm light, Ethan sat on his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the world finally settle. For the first time in what that felt like years, there were no HOA notices taped to his door, no petty threats about mailbox paint or trash bins left out too long. The air felt lighter, the silence sweeter. Across the street, Karen's house remained eerily still. The blinds were shut, the porch lights off, and her prized garden, which she'd once policed like it was a royal courtyard, was beginning to wilt from neglect. Rumors were already swirling that she was planning to sell and disappear before the audit caught up to her. And honestly, Ethan believed it. Karen wasn't the type to face consequences. She was the type to vanish and rewrite the narrative somewhere new, pretending none of this ever happened. But here, in this neighborhood, no one would forget. Not the guests soaked in sludge, not the vendors chasing unpaid invoices, and certainly not the HOA board, now scrambling to clean up the mess she left behind. Ethan's phone buzzed on the armrest beside him. A message from Tom lit up the screen. HOA meeting starts in 30 minutes. Final vote on dissolution. You better show. This is your victory lap. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. It was poetic. Really? After years of battling Karen's rule of dealing with her weaponized bureaucracy, fake fines, and smug superiority, it all came down to one final meeting. One final vote. And this time, the neighborhood was united. He took another sip of coffee, glanced across the yard still littered with ruined decor, and felt no frustrationally pride. That chaos had been worth it. That wedding-turned-nightmare had pulled the veil off Karen's illusion of control, exposing the greed and manipulation beneath her polished surface. Just then, he spotted a movement near her driveway. Karen stepped out, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, sunglasses still covering her face, her phone clutched like a lifeline. She glanced around nervously, like a criminal casing a scene. No clipboard, no smug wave, just desperation. She opened her car door, hesitated, then drove off into the fading light. Ethan watched her go without a word. No parting speech, no final threat, just the sound of her tires squealing one last time. He stood, stretched, and headed inside to grab his keys. There was a meeting to attend, one where, for the first time ever, the homeowners had a real choice. Not a vote rigged with intimidation or fake bylaws, but an actual decision to reclaim their community. And Ethan would be there front and center, not to gloat, but to make sure this time, the people had a voice. As he locked his door, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The tyrant had fallen, the neighborhood had awakened, and tonight, with any luck, the HOA would fall with her. Peace, at last, wasn't just possible, it was already beginning. Valuable lesson. When people allow fear, apathy, or convenience to silence them, it creates space for bullies to seize power. But when one person stands up firm, strategic, and unwilling to be pushed around, it can spark a chain reaction that brings down even the most deeply rooted tyranny. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that boundaries matter, and no amount of fake authority or manipulative charm can override someone's right to be respected in their own home. It also shows the importance of community accountability. When a leader abuses power, silence only fuels their control, but truth, courage, and collective action can expose the rot and restore balance. Whether you're dealing with a literal HOA dictator or a metaphorical one in your life, remember, calculated resistance, backed by integrity and a bit of clever thinking, can dismantle even the most polished facade. Never underestimate the power of saying no when it matters most.